Who decided that Edie Sedgwick was the unstable one, and why did nobody check his version first? For nearly 60 years, the question has gone unasked. Biographers repeated the verdict. Filmmakers repeated the verdict. The man who delivered that verdict was the same man who signed the papers committing his 19-year-old daughter to a psychiatric ward. While nobody asked, a girl with a documented history of being underfed was handed from one institution to another, and then to a man with a camera who filmed her shaking hands and called it art. The answer was never hidden. It sits in hospital intake records, in family letters, in interviews given decades later by people who were in the room when it happened. We are asking it now. The question was always there. The tragic Muse asks it. Subscribe so it never goes unasked again. Nobody asked who got to decide that Edie Sedgwick needed locking up. Not the staff at the hospital who processed her admission. Not the relatives who heard about it secondhand and said nothing. Not the people who, decades later, would write her story as a troubled girl from a troubled family. As if that sentence were an explanation rather than a deflection. Here is what the record actually shows. Edith Minturn Sedgwick was born in 1943 in Santa Barbara, California, the seventh of 8 children in a family whose name carried weight on both coasts. On one side, an old New England lineage stretching back to a Massachusetts judge. On the other, California cattle money. Her father, Francis Minturn Sedgwick, went by Duke or Fuzzy, depending on who was talking, and ran a working cattle ranch in the hills above Santa Barbara called Corral de Quade. He sculpted in his spare time. He posed for magazines with his children arranged around him like a catalog of good breeding. The handsome rancher patriarch, the picture of vigorous American stock. People who knew the family described him, consistently, as magnetic in public and frightening in private. The kind of father whose temper nobody discussed at the dinner table, because discussing it wasn't allowed. This was not, accounts suggest, a private failing he kept hidden from everyone. Several of his children, not only Edie, later described an atmosphere in the household built around his moods, his physical presence, and an instability that the family's wealth and social standing existed, in part, to paper over. The Sedgwick children grew up performing a kind of normalcy for cameras and houseguests that did not match what happened once the cameras left. By her teenage years, Edie was severely underweight. Accounts from people close to the family describe a pattern of binging and purging that worsened through her years at boarding school. At 19, she was admitted to a psychiatric facility, by most accounts, first for treatment connected to the eating disorder, and later to Silver Hill, a private psychiatric institution in Connecticut favored by wealthy families who needed a discreet place to send a relative without the arrangement becoming public. Admission papers for a teenager require a guardian's signature. In Edie's case, that guardian was her father. Nobody asked, at the time or for years afterward, why the man requesting psychiatric treatment for his daughter was the same man whose own conduct inside that house had never once been examined by anyone with the authority to do so. The committal became the official starting point of her story, troubled since youth, and the man who set that diagnosis in motion was never asked to account for what came before it. That door had been locked since the question was first suppressible. But that answer unlocks something the first question couldn't reach. If Edie's instability was treated as the cause of her hospitalization, rather than investigated as a possible symptom of something happening to her at home, then every institution that touched her afterward, doctors, friends, eventually Andy Warhol himself, inherited that framing without ever testing it. Once a wealthy, respected father has told the story first, almost nobody downstream feels entitled to ask it a second time. Nobody asked. Nobody asked what Edie actually said, in her own words, about why she was the way she was. They asked what was wrong with her. They rarely asked who had made her that way. According to accounts gathered for Gene Stein's 1982 oral biography of Edie, built from interviews with people who knew her personally, including family members, psychiatrists, and friends from both Santa Barbara and New York, Edie told more than one person, including at least one treating psychiatrist, that her father had sexually abused her beginning in childhood. These are recollections relayed secondhand, never tested in a courtroom, never the subject of a criminal complaint. No legal finding exists and none ever will. What does exist is a consistent pattern. Multiple people, independently, recalling that she said the same thing at different points in her life, years apart, long before disclosures like that carried any cultural permission to be believed, let alone investigated. Nobody followed up. Not formally, not informally, not in any way the record preserves. The family's wealth bought privacy, and privacy, in a family like the Sedgwicks, functioned as protection for the parents, not the children. The pattern extends past Edie. Of her 7 siblings, 2 brothers died before she did, both young, both with documented psychiatric histories. Francis Sedgwick Jr., known within the family as Minty, had also struggled with his mental health and had also, like Edie, spent time institutionalized. He died by suicide in 1964. Robert Bobby Sedgwick died the following year in a motorcycle accident that some who knew the family found difficult, at the time, to separate entirely from despair. The official record calls it an accident. Nobody asked at the time why 2 siblings out of 8 had died within HLY a year of each other, both in their 20s, both carrying psychiatric histories that traced back to the same household and the same father. 2 children dead before Edie was even 22. One question never filed by anyone with the standing to file it. What was happening inside that house that produced this pattern generation after generation of the same children? And why was the answer always located in the children rather than in the parents who raised them? She paid for asking. She kept asking anyway. The cost of that silence wasn't abstract. Compounded. Every institution that processed Edie after 1962, every intake form, every psychiatric evaluation, every magazine profile that would later call her wild or self-destructive, built on the foundation her father had laid first. That the problem began and ended inside her, not inside the house she'd grown up in. Nobody asked. Nobody asked how a family with that much wealth produced that much damage, or why the wealth itself seemed to buy silence rather than help. The Sedgwicks were, by any measure, rich. The ranch alone, thousands of acres in the Santa Barbara Hills, represented generational money layered on top of more money. Magazine spreads in the early 1960s photographed the family as a kind of American aristocracy. The handsome patriarch, the elegant wife, the photogenic children on horseback against a backdrop of California hills. Life and other national publications ran features presenting the Sedgwicks as the picture of old money, grace, and good health. By 1965, the press attention had shifted to Edie specifically. Vogue ran a feature on her as part of a wider piece on a new kind of young, restless American woman it was calling a youth Quaker, celebrating her energy, her style, her unmistakable presence on camera. The family's actual private life, the hospitalizations, the deaths, the allegations circulating quietly among people who knew them, never made it onto any of those pages. The gap between the public image and the private record was not incidental. It was managed. Francis Sedgwick controlled the money, and the money controlled what got discussed. According to multiple accounts, when Edie came of age and gained access to a trust, he attempted to restrict her use of it. Later, as her life in New York diverged further from what he considered acceptable, reports describe him threatening to cut off her financial support altogether. The same man who had her committed at 19 still held leverage over her at 22, and used it. This is the part that almost never gets asked. Wealth is usually treated in stories like this as a kind of safety net. Money meant she always had a soft landing somewhere. The record suggests something closer to the opposite. The money was the leash. It was conditional, and the condition was silence and compliance, enforced by the same person who had already shaped how the rest of the world understood her. What the before and after reveals, the gap between the Golden Magazine family and the closed hospital file sitting behind it, is the whole story in miniature. A public myth maintained by money, and a private reality the money was specifically used to keep quiet. But that answer unlocks something the first 2 couldn't reach. By the time Edie left for New York at the end of 1964, she had already been taught, by every adult who should have protected her, that the version of events that mattered most was her father's version. She arrived in Manhattan having learned, before she ever met Andy Warhol, that being looked at and being cared for were not the same thing, and that the people most invested in how she appeared were rarely the people invested in how she actually was. The question sat there. Nobody asked why a man who built his career on stripping away artifice never once examined what he was actually filming when he pointed a camera at Edie Sedgwick. She moved to New York in late 1964, enrolled briefly in art classes, and by early 1965 had been introduced, through filmmaker Lester Persky and Warhol associate Chuck Wine, according to multiple accounts, to Andy Warhol at his studio known as The Factory. He was already an established pop artist. She was 21, thin, fast-talking, dressed in striped tights and oversized earrings, photogenic in a way the era hadn't quite seen yet. Within months she had appeared in roughly a dozen of his films, among them Poor Little Rich Girl, Face, Beauty Number 2, and Restaurant, and the press had started calling her a Warhol superstar, a term Warhol himself helped popularize specifically around her. Poor Little Rich Girl, filmed in 1965, follows Edie through her morning routine, waking up, dressing, talking on the phone, shot in a single unbroken take that, due to a camera lens error, runs almost entirely out of focus. Warhol reportedly considered the mistake an improvement and kept it in the final film. Whatever its artistic merit, the title itself was not subtle. It named exactly what Edie represented to the people filming her, a wealthy young woman whose privilege and her unraveling were treated, openly, as the same source of fascination. Beauty Number 2, filmed later that year, goes further. Edie appears on camera in bed with a male companion while an off-screen voice, belonging to Chuck Wine, interrogates her on camera about her personal life, her sexuality, and her family, pushing increasingly intrusive and provocative questions until she becomes visibly upset. The footage was kept. It was screened. It is still, today, cited by film historians as one of the more uncomfortable documents of that period at the factory. A recorded instance of someone close to her deliberately working to provoke a breakdown in front of a camera, for the camera's benefit. Here is what almost never makes it into the romantic version of this story. Edie was not paid, or was paid only nominal sums, for appearing in these films. That was the standard arrangement at the factory. Warhol's superstars provided their presence, their personalities, sometimes literally their unraveling in front of the camera, and received exposure rather than wages. For most people drawn into Warhol's orbit, that exchange was a calculated risk they chose. For Edie, already burning through inherited money, her father periodically threatened to cut off. It left her financially exposed at precisely the moment she most needed stability. The factory in 1965 ran on amphetamines. Methadone and other stimulants circulated freely through Warhol's circle, used to stay awake through marathon filming sessions and all-night socializing. Edie, who had a documented history of an eating disorder and at least one prior psychiatric hospitalization, entered an environment where appetite suppression and sleeplessness were treated as a lifestyle rather than a warning sign. Multiple people close to the factory later described watching her amphetamine use escalate visibly across 1965, and nobody with the standing to stop the filming or to change the environment did so. I found this question in a footnote, buried inside a much longer account of that period. One sentence noting that nobody at the factory ever discussed limiting Edie's drug use, because it made her more interesting on camera. Nobody had ever followed that sentence anywhere. I don't know why. It sat there, unexamined, in the middle of a story that had already been told 100 times. The first question, who decided she was unstable, opens directly into a second one here. Who decided that filming her instability counted as art, and who benefited from that decision? That door had been locked since the question was first suppressible. Nobody asked what happened the moment Edie stopped being useful to the people around her, or how quickly the warmth disappeared once she did. By late 1965, Edie's allegiance inside Warhol's circle had begun shifting toward a different CR. Aud, associates of Bob Dylan, including his manager Albert Grossman and his road manager Bobby Newirth. Accounts from the period, including ones later collected by Gene Stein, describe rising tension between Warhol and Edie, sharpened by speculation, never confirmed by either party, and disputed for decades afterward, about a romantic involvement between Edie and Dylan. Whatever the truth of that rumor, the practical effect was a rupture. Warhol's interest in Edie, total only a few months earlier, cooled sharply and publicly. The timing matters. This was the same period in which her father, according to multiple accounts, was reducing or threatening to cut off her financial support entirely. She lost access to the factory's spotlight and her family's money in close succession, with no institution, not Warhol, not her family, not a treating physician with the authority to intervene, stepping in to manage what was now an accelerating crisis. In 1966, fire broke out in her room at the Chelsea Hotel, where she was living. Reports describe her falling asleep with a lit cigarette, a habit made far more dangerous by heavy sedative and stimulant use. She survived. The pattern repeated across the following years. More fires, more hospitalizations, more attempts at treatment that did not hold. Through this stretch, Warhol's public posture toward Edie was largely one of distance. He never publicly acknowledged responsibility for the trajectory of someone he had, 18 months earlier, built into an international symbol of his own movement. A long-planned film meant to chronicle her life began shooting around 1967, under directors Chuck Wine, John Palmer, and David Weissman, and would not reach screens until 1972, under the title Chow, Manhattan. Production stalled for years and eventually resumed in color around 1970 and 1971, by which point the filmmakers had decided to fold Edie's real, ongoing decline directly into the footage rather than work around it, filming her, in some sequences, from inside a sunken bathtub on her family's ranch property, narrating fragments of her own life while still struggling with addiction. The finished film blends scripted scenes from 1967 with documentary footage of a woman in genuine crisis, released to the public only after her death, as a kind of artifact of the very collapse it had partly stood by and recorded. The second time she asked, implicitly through the wreckage of her life, for someone to step in, the cost was different. That was not an accident. The people who had profited from her visibility in 1965 had little financial or reputational stake in her recovery by 1967. The economics of the relationship had only ever run in one direction. She paid for asking. She kept asking anyway. What the before and after reveals. A luminous 21-year-old in 1965, a hospitalized, fire-scarred woman barely 2 years later, is the whole story compressed into roughly 24 months. Nobody intervened in that gap, because nobody involved was positioned to profit from intervening. The question sat there. Nobody asked what it meant that the people who had built her into a symbol had nothing to say once the symbol stopped performing. Through the late 1960s, Edie moved between New York, California, and a series of hospitals and rehabilitation programs. Friends from this period describe a woman trying, repeatedly and sincerely, to recover, interspersed with relapses that were, by then, treated almost as background noise by people who had known her for years. She was briefly involved with other figures in and around the factory's orbit, including actor Gerard Malanga and others connected to Warhol's films, none of whom appear in any surviving account to have taken on responsibility for her well-being once the cameras moved on to someone else. That detail matters because of what came next. Warhol's superstar system did not stop with Edie. As her presence faded, he turned his attention to their women, Nico, Ingrid Superstar, Viva, each cultivated, photographed, and filmed in turn, each eventually replaced. The pattern was not unique to Edie's case. It was the system itself. She was simply the first version of it, and the version whose collapse happened most visibly, most publicly, and most quickly. Reports from people who crossed paths with Warhol after Edie's decline became impossible to ignore describe a man who treated questions about her with a kind of practiced detachment, acknowledging her significance to his work, while declining to discuss any obligation he might have had toward her as a person. Nobody in his circle, by any surviving account, ever pressed him on that distinction. That door had been locked since the question was first suppressible. By 1969 and 1970, Edie had returned largely to the Santa Barbara area, closer to the family whose silence had shaped the entire trajectory of her adult life. She entered a psychiatric facility in Santa Barbara, where, according to multiple accounts, she met Michael Post, a fellow patient. Friends from this period describe cautious optimism, a relationship that seemed, for the first time in years, oriented toward stability rather than spectacle. Nobody asked in November of 1971 whether the cause of death written on Edie Sedgwick's certificate was the real cause or just the most recent one. She married Michael Post in July of that year. Friends and family describe a period of genuine, careful hope. On the night of November 15th into November 16th, 1971, she attended an event and returned home. She was found unresponsive the next morning and was pronounced dead at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. The official cause of death was recorded as acute barbiturate intoxication. The county's finding left intent unresolved, undetermined, neither clearly accidental nor clearly deliberate. She was 28 years old. This is where the question from the beginning of this film finally gets a sword. Who decided Edie Sedgwick was the unstable one, and why did nobody check his version first? Her father decided it in 1962, when he signed the papers that sent her to a psychiatric hospital without anyone examining what role he may have played in producing her condition. That decision did not stay contained inside one family. It became the operating assumption for every institution that touched her afterward. Doctors treated her instability as a pre-existing condition rather than investigating its origin. Magazine writers described her as troubled without ever asking troubled by what. Andy Warhol and the people around him treated her volatility as raw material, useful on camera, disposable off it, because the framing had already been set before she ever walked through their door. This was simply who Edie was, not something that had been done to her. By the time she died, the verdict her father delivered 9 years earlier had been repeated by enough people, in enough contexts, that it no longer needed defending. It had become background fact. A barbiturate overdose in a young woman with a long psychiatric history surprised almost nobody, and that lack of surprise is itself the indictment. An ending like that only looks inevitable if you accept, without ever testing it, the story someone else told first. That door had been locked since the question was first suppressible. It is open now. Nobody asked, for nearly 60 years, who benefited from believing that Edie Sedgwick was simply, inherently, the broken one. Not her father, who was never himself examined. Not Warhol, who got roughly 18 months of footage out of a young woman's collapse and took on no obligation toward her recovery. Not the institutions that processed her in and out of their wards without once asking what she was actually being treated for, only that she needed treating. The question is being asked now. The answer was always there. In the decades since her death, Edie Sedgwick has been the subject of a 1982 oral biography assembled by Gene Stein from dozens of interviews, the 1972 film Ciao, Manhattan, and, in 2006, a dramatized feature called Factory Girl, which sparked its own legal dispute when Bob Dylan's representatives objected to his depiction and the character was altered before release. Each retelling added detail. None of them, by most honest accounts, fully closed the gap between the image, eyeliner, oversized earrings, black tights, a face that briefly defined 1965, and the woman who lived underneath it. That gap exists because the question this film opened with was never properly asked while she was alive to answer it, and because everyone who came after her father accepted, at least partially, the story he had told first. The pop culture that mythologized her as a tragic muse did something quieter and just as costly. It turned the unanswered question into an aesthetic, a mood, a vibe of doomed glamour, instead of a fact that needed investigating. The woman underneath the image did not get the same chance the image got because too many people who could have asked the harder question chose not to, and benefited from that choice. That is the story this film followed. Not an answer that needed to be discovered, but one that needed, finally, to be asked.